I had so many friends. They were talking to me like, oh, Caroline, do you have a boyfriend? We all do and everything. Like, we should like double date or something. It's like, I don't need a boyfriend.
Yeah. It's your dad.
Yeah. I don't need a boyfriend because I have my dad.
You talk about yourself as your daughter's boyfriend. That's going to have a lot of people, make an awful lot of people uncomfortable. It's way too Freudian. How do you...
See, this is what I find absolutely humorous in our culture today, where something as pure as a daddy going out with his daughter on a date is twisted to make it seem like, as you mentioned, Freudian. I wasn't thinking about Freud at all. I was thinking about...
Welcome back. So in our last part of our Purity Culture series, the Old Testament taught us to bust in our sister-in-law. The New Testament told us not to bust at all. And we left that video feeling both sexually incomplete and confused, much like a modern-day Catholic priest. And also like a modern Catholic priest, now we must turn our attention to the children of our churches, because we are fast-forwarding quite a bit into the modern era. The sexual revolution is in full swing, the church is at a loss, numbers declining, the youth becoming more progressive and disillusioned, and at this point, the evangelical church is already dealing with a lot of problems from what it would describe as a socialist or even communist ideology, the civil rights movement. And while Dr. King's connections between racial injustice and economic injustice are being talked about, the fact is, in reality, some of these churches, especially in the South, were already looking for ways to poke holes in the theology of the civil rights movement anyways. And there's good reasons for bringing up racial tensions when we talk about the creation of purity culture, which admittedly won't be an actual mainstay in the cultural zeitgeist of evangelical churches until well into the 90s. And that reason, of course, underlines some of the earliest forms of purity culture's problematic ties. Purity culture, for many of my fellow 90s kids, was always viewed as a sexual ideology. But in the 60s, purity meant something else, and that's racial purity. And in an attempt to keep the youth in line, one of the main tactics of those opposing sides of the civil rights movement when speaking to young women would be to find any way possible to remind these young white evangelicals about the dangers of interracial sex. And in fact, it's not until 1967 that interracial marriage is even legalized in 16 of the last holdout states, all of whom refused to make mixed marriages legal, with Alabama even still refusing to marry mixed racial marriages for years afterwards, with some judges refusing to back off. So much so that Alabama citizens were forced to finally amend its entire constitution in reference to interracial marriages in the year, wait for it, 2000. Like, after cell phones existed. Holy Christ. Like, I am a millennial, and you mean to tell me that I was born years before interracial marriages were finally legalized in the Alabama state constitution? You know what else happened in the year 2000? The Segway was invented in the year 2000. Racial marriage in Alabama was constitutionalized the same year that the Segway came out. My God. And speaking of segues, that brings us to the modern era of evangelical Christianity. It's the 90s, and people are loving that baggy aesthetic, and I don't know, the Home Alone franchise. And the church is once again taking as much control over the younger generations as they can, because these younger generations are again, quote unquote, spiraling out of control. The youth are once again pushing back on the cultural ideals of the church. Homosexuality is slowly gaining in popular approval amongst the young. AIDS is an epidemic of huge proportions, so the church searches for a solution, and their solution is to go back to their heritage. Conservative family values. White women marrying white men, popping out 3 kids, and making apple pies. They see as a threat the increasing cultural acceptance of women in the workplace and choosing careers and multiple sexual partners over traditional married life. Sex outside of marriage is targeted as a major factor of the erosion of quote-unquote Christian values, and the focus quickly finds itself at home with the traditional marriage and conservative family system that the evangelical church loves by focusing on young girls. Young men are assumed to be the future faith leaders of their households, and of course, these households are being indoctrinated by faith systems that are being led by male-dominated churches in a male-dominated society, but in that assumption, these household leaders are considered, ironically, both so strong that they must be in charge of their families, and yet also so weak that they must rely on the women around them to keep them from straying from their faith's call to purity. And so women are told how to dress, how to act, how to dance, not dance, and how to care for their fellow man's sexuality. Women are placed on the defensive in the church by being confirmed as a sexual object, their worth to their husbands being instructed by their sexual purity and what they can offer to their husband and his sexual needs. Bible verses are being brought out about women being quiet in the church, as they had been for centuries, along with Bible verses about women being subservient to their husbands, as they had been for centuries. And in the misuse of these types of theological abominations are the justifications that we have for systematically ruining an entire generations of women's self-worth. Husbands were taught to worry about the sex lives of their wives past and the state of their own daughters' vaginas, as if they had any control or anything they could do to control it. And of course, if they couldn't control their daughters' vaginas, then were they really the spiritual leaders that the Bible had asked them to be? Probably not.
Does any part of you think that it is quite patriarchal in that, there was chastity belts in the medieval ages? Is this a kind of almost a continuation of that?
I believe that there is freedom in submission, and so right now these young girls are voluntarily choosing to be obedient to their fathers, and in the same way that I choose to submit to my husband's leadership.
The purity culture in the 90s had alienated men and women from one another. We saw things that came out of books, like about dating and talks about how men and women had differing roles in the relationships. And all of us that were captured by this movement were left reeling, trying to figure out, what do? We have two options. We can either throw away everything in its entirety, or we can try to exist within it. And I come from a place of trying to exist within it. I was a younger person in the 90s and early 2000s, and I did the dance with the best of them. I had a church that was willing to give me a list of all sorts of things that I was not allowed to do, or more importantly, all the qualities that I should be looking for in a prospective partner. Yet, I found myself very underinformed about my sexuality. I was taught to be afraid of my sexuality by the church, as if it were some kind of untamable monster that I had to somehow control. Yet, I was also abandoned to figure out the specific mechanics of sex on my own. I was not taught about safe sex or the dangers of sex, except for by the public school system, and I was never told what was and wasn't really allowed. In some ways, I was almost left with the impression that nothing was allowed, and that ever touching a girl, embracing a woman in any way, was a slippery slope to just completely penetrating them, which is ridiculous. Not to mention that just on the other side of marriage, the day you get married to your spouse, whom you've been afraid to touch for the last several years of dating, you are expected to absolutely bang the shit out of each other. There's this uncomfortable duality between purity culture that simultaneously teaches men and women to be afraid of their bodies until the day you slide the ring on your finger, and then this instant pressure for procreation the day that you are married.
We just really felt like that we need to give this area of our life to God.
We prayed, we said, Father, forgive us and give us a love for children like you love children. And we gave that area of our life to the Lord. And right after that, God blessed us with twins.
It's ridiculous, it's insane, and realistically, it's traumatizing for both men and women to transition to this pressure. The thought process of the church seems to me to be that we are supposed to basically just be edging our future spouses for years, not crossing this imaginary line until the evening you finally fill out the paperwork so that you are officially obliged to just fuck non-stop. There is a huge disconnect between the church and the culture that the church inhabits, which is kind of the problem that this channel explores anyways, but specifically in this case, I think the church harms the youth that they pretend to care about by being so confused with how people relate to one another in contemporary culture that men and women are being taught to fear each other's genitals for decades. And I do not believe that leads to well-developed adults or well-functioning relationships, much less marriages. And sure, you might say that in a way there are parts of culture that Jesus does tell us to reject, and I agree with you. After all these years of abuse and the dire situations that I've been placed in with my own relationships, I still find myself wondering just how purity and abstinence fit in with my own belief system. Maybe it even still does in some minor ways. But regardless of that, the key to solving the problem is to get past the lack of communication. The church needs to not be afraid of hard topics in conversation. Always, time and time again, I find myself with a similar predicament. The church could tackle a hard topic, but that would require them to get uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable is not okay. Despite the Gospels seemingly tell us that Jesus wants us to do just that, get uncomfortable. For now, I need to denounce what this model of purity culture is. We've seen it take a lot of different shapes, and we've seen it result in a lot of different problematic behaviors, from the creation of needless fuel for sex pests and predators to the added stressors on marriages and the cause of divorce. If we do not stop forcing women into boxes and making men fear their own sex drives and creating monstrous oppressors and adherents to the patriarchal religious systems that have long lost their favor with the culture around us, we might as well just give up on evangelical churches altogether. Women aren't going to continuously buy into this cultic oppression, and as a man, I'm not going to continue to prescribe to a pseudo-Christianity that supposedly doesn't even take Jesus seriously enough to speak frankly on a subject like sex and sex education. Evangelicals contributed to a lot of disgusting things, but this might be the worst, and for that, I say to the evangelical church, grow up. Learn what a real relationship ought to be like, because the last time I checked, even if women or men were literal prostitutes, Jesus would be sitting with them, not you. But that's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks for watching. Next time we'll talk more about men and how the church has really left men to fend for themselves on a lot of things. I find that this has created a vacuum and has allowed certain types of individuals to step forward and not only abuse women, but abuse men and leading them astray. Subscribe if you can, and most importantly, I love you all.